Excellent. So I thought what I would do today is give you a brief overview of some of the work I've done, starting with my research in 2010 in Nigeria, which came I was doing research there a couple of months after this new Nigerian content law was passed. And so it was a very interesting time to be thinking about how the country can make better use of its petroleum resources. And I'm not going to go into the history, I think, with this group of people about Nigeria's oil industry and attempts to create development from it. But Nigerian content, which actually started in the early 2000s to be pursued seriously by various government agencies and by the Nigerian oil industry, offered to me, I think, a new potential for figuring out a way to have positive developmental outcomes from the oil and gas industry. So when I was doing my research in Nigeria, I went around interviewing government officials and indigenous companies and trying to understand the potential impact of this new law that had been created. And I think I realized quite quickly that there was enormous potential here, potential to capture value that is not far off from the value that Nigeria was getting just from the revenues of petroleum. And of course, there were a lot of pronouncements in this era that direct and indirect jobs would be created, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and billions of dollars would be retained in the Nigerian economy. And some of this has happened, and some of this obviously hasn't happened for a variety of reasons. But there's certainly a new potential to work on the making better use of the economic activity that's associated, the linkages that are associated with the oil and gas industry. What I did in 2010 was, and this is sort of described in my book, I profiled various local companies and tried to understand how they would be able to benefit from the Nigerian content law. And there were a variety of companies that I looked into. I was going to try and present a couple of these profiles to you, but I think I'll just describe in detail. There were some companies that were, in a more traditional sense, larger companies trying to benefit from privileged access to the Nigerian oil industry. But there were a lot of local companies and companies that had previously been foreign owned but had brought in Nigerian owners that were attempting to add value in country, that were looking for support from the government and a better business environment for doing this. And so I think there was reason for a lot of optimism. And in 2015, I spent some time going back to many of these same companies to try and understand what they've been able to accomplish. And there again, the record has, in my opinion, been somewhat mixed. Some companies have really been able to benefit from not so much the mechanisms of the law itself, but from the increased attention people are paying to Nigerian content, both the government and the regulators and the newly formed NCDMB, but also from the international oil companies who were paying much closer attention to local content and trying very hard to make sure there was increased in-country value. So when I try and think about what has worked in Nigeria, I think of several positive examples. I think of things that the oil industry and oil companies have done new capacity development initiatives that I described in an article of mine in 2014, audits that they have done of various sectors in order to find new ways of involving local businesses and involving Nigerians, both as entrepreneurs but also as employees of their companies. I think there have been some successes with supplier databases and with business support. There's certainly been a major effort both by the government and by companies. I think you'll hear about some of that from Shell when they speak, to provide more access to capital to Nigerian companies, which was one of the things I heard over and over again in my research, that they wanted more access to capital. And there's been successes in key areas, as I mentioned, of performing services in country that previously we weren't able to perform in country, to provide Nigerian line pipes and valves, to do more front-end engineering and data processing in Nigeria, to have large overseas manufacturers set up facilities in Nigeria, large fabrication companies being able to perform even the integration, topside integration of an FPSO in Nigeria. So there have been lots of successes. I think in terms of what hasn't worked, measurement is still one of the big questions left unresolved. One of the issues that I think makes it difficult to actually know what impact the law has had and what impact various amendments or changes to the law could have. There's also been a question of whether Nigerian content should be pursued by a strong government intervention and regulations and setting of targets, or by government working more with companies in various forums in order to ensure that they're doing everything they can to increase local content. In my view, it's been a combination of both in Nigeria, and both have had successes and failures that I don't really have time to go into. But one of the biggest issues, and what hasn't really worked, is the number of targets that have been set in Nigeria. Instead of focusing on a few key issues, trying to raise Nigerian content across the board in a very short amount of time has maybe made it more difficult to achieve some of the larger goals in terms of in-country value. And it's been very difficult to match the successes nationally with Nigerian content with successes at the community level and in the Niger Delta. When I have spoken to people from various international oil companies in the past, they've focused on the need to ensure community content as well. And I know that's been very important for Shell in Nigeria. But Nigerian content, if it works ideally and if it works the way I think the law intends it to work, will have most of the benefits at a national level in major cities and not necessarily in the communities that host oil extraction. So there's going to be a continued need for corporate social responsibility, but also for government programs to redistribute wealth and make sure everybody is benefiting. And that's always been a difficulty in Nigeria. It's been an ongoing challenge to make sure that there's public participation in the government's drive for higher levels of Nigerian content. I've noticed over the years that civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, have been more focused in Nigeria on other issues such as industry restructuring and the Niger Delta, and not so much on making sure there's a great benefit from Nigerian content. Although I think that might be beginning to change with media outlets more interested in Nigerian content, with labor unions more interested and with various industry associations playing a bigger role. I just briefly, before I hand over, I want to talk about some of the major issues that I imagine will come up in the questions. Right now, Nigeria is again considering amendments to the Nigerian content law. On the one hand, I think these are probably necessary and have been necessary for some time, but I also worry about what happens when this law gets opened up and there's a new attempt made to satisfy everybody's interests in the law. I think we're going to have to pay attention to the way that the new Nigerian Content Development Fund is being used, make sure that data about the fund is being shared, so all entrepreneurs in Nigeria have some confidence in this fund and a sense that they can access it when needed. General industry restructuring in the oil industry in Nigeria is obviously going to be something that will impact Nigerian content in the future. And finally, there's questions about how Nigeria can pursue a regional approach to local content, which I think becomes increasingly important as Nigerian companies, so many of them are have a large amount of capacity compared to their neighbors, and might be more able to participate in oil and gas industries across West Africa, across the continent, and potentially even worldwide. So I think I'll leave things there, and I'm looking forward to all of your excellent questions.
Thanks very much, Jesse. That was a really good overview, and I think obviously once we get into Kathy and Austin speaking, a lot of these kind of debates will become more practical as we go into some practical examples. So with that in mind, I'll pass it over to you, Kathy, to talk about Shell's approach, and then and you and Austin can sort of share your approach, maybe how you do it globally versus how you do it in Nigeria, and how that interconnects.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, great. I don't know if you can switch to the next slide that we have sent. No, it's just the organogram of the way that Shell is set up to deliver on local content.
You have,
No, it's not in this slide pack. It's the second attachment that I had sent.
Oh, wait, do I have it? Sorry, one second. One second here. I can get those. It's going to take me a moment. Sorry. When did you send those?
Yesterday. It's not urgent. It's just an organogram of how Shell has set itself up to respond to the questions that you just raised about the global role that my team does in delivering local content for our government and host countries projects, and then just a quick introduction to the team. Maybe I'll just go ahead while you find it. Yeah.
Ahead. Sorry.
Okay. So just a quick introduction of myself. My name's Kathy Koo. I just joined the Shell Local Content Government Relations team in January, and before that, I was with the World Bank in the investment policy team for a long time, for 16 years, working mainly in the Africa context, but also with different administrations. We got called by the Trump administration to support their localization efforts. You see how successful we were there. So a lot of different country contexts. I was based out of headquarters in Vienna and also in a number of different field offices. So I joined Shell in January, and the slide that we'll pull up in a minute basically shows the Shell setup in terms of delivering local content to our projects and to the host countries that we operate in. So what I wanted to show was that it's actually a cross-functional team. So you'll see that I'm one of about 7 people across different functions that work together on a very regular basis to assess a situation, a project, a country, and decide on which parts of the business and which parts of our host countries need the most assistance. So from the government relations side, I very much view it from the context. As Jesse, you had mentioned, the regional approaches to local content, but also the global, and how the global trade and investment environment and how they govern local content requirements should affect a government's policy. And so if you look at some of the work that government relations does, we very much engage with governments on trying to design forward-looking, innovative policies which help countries become competitive and help them diversify using the extractive endowment as a means of diversifying and developing other sectors. So that's very much where the government relations functions. But of course, the Center of Excellence, which we call it the Local Content Center of Excellence, sits in contracting and procurement, and for good reasons. I see Ileana from Exxon is on the line, but I think that we would agree that you cannot underestimate the importance of contracting and procurement in terms of achieving local content. Much of this is about dealing with very specific subsector supply chains, and so being able to bundle and unbundle contracts is an important part of that. We also have a social performance team, which focuses, as Jesse mentioned, on the local community content, because it does indeed affect our license to operate. And last but not least is that this is all managed and coordinated by our fearless leader, Helen Sullivan, who's also on the line. And so she makes sure that we are all sharing information and connecting. So that's me, and that's Shell, Center of Excellence for Local Content. What I want to do is just make a quick introduction again to Austin, and also to ask a question since I have the floor. For now, I'll take advantage to ask a challenging question, which you can hopefully address, Austin, and maybe Jesse, you can also go back to this point. So Austin joined Shell more than 10 years ago, and he's been in different roles, not just in sitting out of our contract and procurement team, but also he's had extensive work on the upstream dimension of the Shell business, and also he's held several different engineering roles before coming to Shell. So he's coordinated quite a bit, not just internally, but also with external organizations like the bank, the World Bank, GIZ, IFC, and UKTI DFID. So some of the very interesting and innovative work coming out of Shell Nigeria is something which Austin can speak to very much. The question which I would pose to both of them is one which is that Jesse talks about and has been written about, and that is that on the local content regulations and the deployment of the Act. So Jesse, you had mentioned that sort of is what spurred you to take a look at this area, and you listed the positives and negatives, and with the caveat that maybe not all the benefits to the domestic companies were from the Act, but from the fact that the government focused on providing opportunities. So my question to you is, is the Act and these very hard targets something which you would recommend that governments do? And if so, yes, and why not? And I asked the same question to Austin, he was based in Nigeria, now moving to The Hague to join the local content Center of Excellence team. So please, Austin, if you can enlighten us.
Okay. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Jesse, for actually doing half of the work in terms of putting context to the discussion. Thank you very much. So we'll probably find some time to respond to some of the questions and comments that you've put forward, Kathy, before the end of the presentation, and hopefully I will probably have covered it in the course of my presentation. So good morning and good afternoon to us all. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to share with you at this session. It's indeed a great honor and privilege for me. I have a few slides that I would like to share, but just to give a quick summary, of what I have in my presentation. If you don't remember anything about what I'm going to present today, just take away the fact that Shell believes that local content is good for our business, looking at the long term. And we also believe that it has to be done responsibly and in a sustainable manner. And that really brings home the fact that you cannot do local content without thinking of sustainability. So that's really, really critical in the overall discussion that we're going to have today. Before we go much further, I think it's important to talk about the country Nigeria, just to give us a little bit of context in terms of where we are and who we are. We're a very well-populated and diverse nation. You probably would have observed from the World Bank records that Nigeria has a growing population of over 186 million people, with over 243 ethnic dialects, three major ethnic groups, and some other minority groups. We span about 923,000 square kilometers in size, with a coastline of about 853 kilometers. Obviously, a country endowed with abundant natural resource in terms of resource base. And you could literally count the retinue of resource that you can find in Nigeria. But the topic today is about oil and gas, and how do we all benefit in terms of the oil and gas population. But again, it's important to put into context the kind of population demographics that we have. We have over 36% of our population between ages of 15 and 35. And obviously, by the World Bank estimates, we'll probably be heading towards 392 million by the year 2050, which will make us the third or fourth largest country in the world in terms of global population. In terms of oil and gas proven reserves, we're currently at 185 TCF of gas and 35 billion barrels of oil proven. But obviously, the U.S. Geological Survey estimates figures much higher than that as potentials that need to be exploited in the future. It's important to also put in context the fact that Nigeria also do have a local content law, like Jesse has said. But before the local content law, we actually had some set of directives, 23 in number, which was being administered by the national oil company called the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, NNPC. NNPC actually is in partnership with Shell in the venture, the joint venture which we're running, for which NNPC has 55%, Shell holds 30%, Total holds 10%, and ENI holds 5%. And SPDC is the largest operator in Nigeria. So our footprint spans literally from east to west before now. So I think that gives us a fairly good context of where we sit as a country in Nigeria. But again, Shell as a company has interest in the LNG business in Nigeria, in addition to the offshore business that we operate, which is the Shell Nigeria Exploration and Production Company, SNEPCO, currently running the Bonga assets, which is about 120 kilometers off the coast of Nigeria, producing over 200,000 barrels a day, but that's just the Shell portion. We also do have other operators in Nigeria, six of them in all, all producing about 2 million barrels a day, with the national aspiration to produce up to 4 million barrels. But that's, again, additional work that needs to be done going forward. So Shell is obviously a Nigerian company with over 3,300 people working across the lines of businesses that I've mentioned, 95% of whom are Nigerians. A majority of the senior executives, including the MDs of the JV company, which is the Shell Petro-Development company, and SNEPCO, and obviously the country chairman, are Nigerians. So that makes us clearly a Nigerian company. And we've pioneered, to a large extent, the provision of new skills and technology for the industry. And we've been behind the growth of the energy sector over a long period of time, and having a continued commitment to the country, its people, and the economy. In addition to helping Nigeria unlock its energy resource, one of the most significant ways we've delivered on that commitment is to increase the participation of Nigerian companies and individuals in our supply chain and operations to ensure they benefit from our day-to-day presence as much as possible. It may be worthy of mention that Nigeria signed up to several bilateral and multilateral treaties before now, but the passage of the law obviously, puts that in a separate bucket, and I'll probably have the opportunity to talk about this before the end of the day. So let's talk a little bit about why local content matters. In a world where there's increasing capital pressure and attendant needs to better manage resources, nations are demanding more in terms of direct and collateral benefits in the exploitation of their natural resources. Some would argue that the participation of its people in the development of the natural resource is a strategic economic imperative, while others will allude to the benefits which job creation brings about, both in terms of reducing unemployment and the pressure on government. However, it may be less obvious that the availability of the supply chain, the availability that supply chain creates, helps with the sustainability element in terms of processes and overall outcomes, like Jesse said earlier in his comments. Government expects benefits in terms of employment, education, and the growth of the supply chain, while societies look for the enhancement of the quality of life, reduction in environmental and other undesirable impacts. The operators, on the other hand, look for credible and consistent supply chain. Obviously, the operators are in business and are there to make money sustainably and responsibly. So that's very important. So an integrated supply chain, it's obviously capable of catalyzing the national and regional talent development. And I think I like the point that Jesse made around becoming a regional player, going beyond doing local, while contributing to both the host economy and the economies of our neighbors in the long term. There's obviously a commercial benefit, that the businesses can leverage, both big and small, to continue with the cost improvements and continuous improvement that is possible in the business. Local content, as the name implies, must fit into the context of the country's specific situation and priorities. So that's critical. One feature across the globe is the emphasis on small businesses as agents of growth in the various categories. And increasingly, these players are becoming the key differentiator in the supply chain. We all talk about jobs as a key outcome of local content, but how do you generate the jobs if you don't build the businesses? So it's important to think about the businesses as we go along. Then talking in terms of the value proposition, which is my next slide, that will be slide 3. There's a clear urgency to this task. In the case of Nigeria, over 2 million Nigerian youths are actually looking for placements in the Nigerian universities, for which we only have about 500,000 spaces available. So what happens to the 1.5 million that cannot get into school? So that's obviously not helping with the unemployment rate, which is currently running at about 25%. Even with the projected strong GDP growth of 2.1% per annum, according to the IMF. The challenge is clear. It is how to translate Nigeria's macroeconomic development into opportunities, productive employment, and improved quality of life. That's critical. Given the economic dominance of oil and gas, which in 2017 accounted for about 70% of the budget revenue and more than 90% of its export earnings, it has an important role to play in driving real growth and development in Nigeria. That role is clearly articulated under the provisions of the Nigerian Oil and Gas Industry Content Development Act of 2010, which actually sets out the rules and regulations governing the use of Nigerian content in the industry. Shell companies in Nigeria are fully aligned with these aspirations, and our leadership in Nigerian content development is aimed at ensuring sustainability, productive employment generation, security, amongst others. If we could go to the next slide, Jeff, which is to talk a little bit about the law itself. The law was passed, like Jesse said, in 2010. I was opportune to be one of those who was seconded to help with the early implementation of the law. The law is, to a large extent, viewed as the opportunistic tool that would reverse all the potential challenges that people think they've had in the industry over the past 60 years of oil and gas exploitation. So it means a lot of different things to different people, like Jesse did mention. And I thank you again, Jesse, for putting the right context to this conversation. The law itself has 3 parts. Obviously, one of the most audacious in terms of local content, and it has 104 sections, subdivided into the elements that you would expect for the operator to perform, and the operator is being given the responsibility to deliver on the law. So whether it be in terms of expert quota utilization, whether it be in terms of a first consideration for Nigerian companies in contracting, whether it be in terms of succession planning, so the operator has the responsibility to manage that. The second part talks about the establishment of a board, the Nigerian Content Development and Monitoring Board, NCDMB, which is actually based in the Niger Delta. The Niger Delta is really where most of the oil can be found in Nigeria. The board is saddled with the monitoring and evaluation of the progress that has been made with the law. It's also saddled with the regulation of the compliance levels in the law, and it's also saddled with making appropriate recommendations to the National Assembly on what needs to be changed in the targets that have been set to the Act. The third part actually then deals with the targets themselves. There are 285 subcategories ranging from 45% to 100% implementation requirements. And there are about 20 sections that actually deal with about 100%, which is a total lockdown if you really think about it. But the challenge over the years has been around the supply chain gaps that we've had. So basically that's the way that the law has been structured. There's a 1% fund which is supposed to be deducted at source on an invoice by invoice basis from every contract that is being awarded in the oil and gas industry for the development of capacity in the industry. And if we have time, we may talk about some of how this has benefited the country. Talk a little bit about the Nigerian content as a pivot, for growth, which will be my next slide, Jeff. In unlocking the energy resources, the emphasis must be placed, obviously, on increasing participation of local companies and individuals in the supply chain to ensure that they benefit from what we do on an ongoing basis. There's a clear urgency to train the workforce and create more jobs, building on the government policies in view of the global unemployment in the oil and gas producing countries, despite the GDP growth in some of those countries. The challenge is how to translate what we do into productivity, for the locals. And Kathy did mention about the community content, which is where we pay strong attention to the Niger Delta communities where we operate. We like to give some focused attention and efforts to the people of the Niger Delta where we operate. And we have a few programs, where we've tried to develop Niger Delta companies, as part of our community content offering. The intent is to move away from the agency-style approach, where companies just come, we call them briefcase companies that don't really have a credible presence in Nigeria. They come in and then they have a business name and begin to operate in the country, not adding value, but are seen as, engaging in part of the capital flight without creating the much needed value. So we're beginning to move away from that, given the provisions of the law, to a regime where we're beginning to have some level of domestication in terms of new investments, in terms of new product lines that are now being manufactured in Nigeria that meet the Shell standard and the Shell safety requirements, for use in our operation. Shell obviously has been in the forefront of developing such product lines and such companies, taking the more pragmatic approach, knowing fully well that we're going to be there for the long haul. This has helped also to increase investors' confidence, and again, going back to Kathy's question about, is it really working at this time? Yes, it is working. It's increasing the confidence that the policy fluctuations that we've had over the years is, being managed better. So you're clearer in terms of what you get out of the tunnel when you invest in Nigeria. But the challenge obviously then remains the workload. If you're not spending in terms of capex and in terms of operational expenditure, then it becomes very difficult to develop the local content. But once the spend begins to improve, yes, it increases the confidence. And then we're beginning to have a much longer term approach, far more than the interventionist short-term view that we had before, which, saw a lot of companies fizzle out, not too long after they've been established. So that's critical. So in my view, the law has been positive. However, there's the need to have some balancing in terms of what needs to be done, the way that is being managed at the moment. But if you then look at it from the other perspective, if government does nothing, then obviously the operators will probably not have the impetus to want to do more in terms of developing local capabilities. Talk a little bit about the implementation strategy and ease of doing business, and I think that's on the next slide. Jesse is talked quite a bit around some of the challenges that we see. But what have we done in terms of our approach? looking at the way we're structured in terms of our strategy. So we have 6 key buckets, that we've designed to help us overcome some of these. And if you look at the slide deck, you find out that we focus a lot more on indigenous asset ownership, ensuring that Nigerians are able to get in the space where they before now have not been able to participate, by helping them to own assets. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the key examples shortly. In manufacturing, in developing human capital, and then focus supplier development, the kind that we do with the UK, DFID, UKTI before now. And then looking at how do we do research and development that will help us to find Nigerian alternatives, credible Nigerian alternatives made in Nigeria, as opposed to just doing local content. Because we believe that local content is more of a business than just a compliance imperative. So if we're able to get Nigerian companies to the point where they are on their own thinking competitively, thinking about what can they do regionally, what can they do to compete, with the global players, then we've gotten the Nigerian content to the point where it is more sustainable in nature and in our approach. So the energy mix obviously helps, with this economics. I will look to speak a bit more if we find some more time. There are obviously other things that Jesse probably did not touch on as part of the ease of doing business. I just want to point to one or two. The high cost of foreign exchange, which puts a lot of Nigerian suppliers at a disadvantage. The ease of accessing funds. And if you think about a national monetary policy ratio from the Central Bank of Nigeria, which currently stands at 14%, and the cap is about 31%. So obviously the national lending rates are already high, and that makes it very difficult for businesses to remain competitive with their counterparts, given this kind of rates. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how Shell has tried to support some of this. But that's the one aspect that is a huge, huge challenge for us. The other aspect that is a huge challenge is around power. The infrastructural deficit remains significant, although the government is doing so much to close that gap. But there's still a whole lot more to do to get the energy requirements, fixed for the country. So that will help the manufacturers, the service providers to be able to meet with some of the targets that they've set, for growing their businesses. And then obviously the bottlenecks around setting up new businesses, the tax regulations, needs to be harmonized to help new businesses set up real quick. I will not close without mentioning some of the successes that Nigerian content team of Shell and Shell as a company have been able to deliver. So obviously anchored on the 6 major thrusts which I just described. One of the areas that we focused on is around supply development. Under supply development, we realized that there was a credibility issue for Nigerian companies and Nigerian businesses trying to partner with global companies. And in 2009, we set up this partnering set of initiatives with UK vendors, with Chinese vendors, with Indian vendors, to help Nigerian companies bridge the gap that they have, in trying to find the right partners overseas, and setting up partnership programs in Nigeria and outward programs in those other countries. The most recent being the last one in China, which was held in November of 2017. Some of the benefits have come through, and Nigerian companies are now able to partner better with foreign companies as they would have loved to. The other bit is around the fund, and I think Jesse mentioned a little bit of it, but I'm just going to give more details. We got Nigerian banks together to set up a fund where we can have lowered interest rate for Nigerian service providers who are trying to access funds. We are not there yet where we ought to be, but it's trending in the right direction, and which is downwards. The overall plan is to actually have it at single-digit interest rates. But the Nigerian Content Development and Monitoring Board, tapping into the 1% Nigerian Content Development Fund, which it still has in its coffers, is doing a whole lot more now to drive the opportunity for the single-digit interest rates under the Nigerian Content Support Fund, which I think they put down $200 million to start off the initiative. And I think that's, again, another trend in the right direction to support some of Shell's efforts. Obviously, other operators, have also set up their own funds after Shell had, recorded successes in this. To date, from 2011, about $1.5 billion has been drawn by service providers, who are involved in projects, in maintenance and procurement of special equipment for what they do. I will find this very, very interesting. One of the key areas, and I'm just going to give a couple of examples in the interest of time, is around indigenous asset ownership. Some of us might have heard about Caverton helicopters, working with Dancopter, at the time. We took the risk, evaluated the company in terms of its safety requirements, and supported with some funding, some seed funding, which was amortized through the life of the contract, to buy 6 Agosto Westland 139 helicopters for the company. And since then, which is about 5 years ago, they've now moved from just supporting Shell to becoming regional players. And this is one of the big areas of our support on local content that we're really, really proud of. They become a world-class player, and we'd like to see them do more within the region. We've also used the same strategy on the marine area, working with companies like C&I Leasing, Video Shipping, supporting companies like Avion, Domalong, just to mention a few, in terms of acquiring assets to support our operations, and the value and return of the investment being amortized over some period of time. But one of the key ones that I find very interesting, which is very dear to my heart, something we pursued very vigorously, which is finding local alternatives in terms of raw materials, in terms of some of the components that we use for the oil and gas industry. So you just imagine a country that really wants to grow and thrive in terms of local content, not having a stud boat manufacturing facility. So we did take the risk, worked with a local company called the Nigerian Machine Tools Company, which would have been before now struggling, on what next to do, to develop locally made stud boats and nuts, working with Beck Prosper of the UK. This was very successful, and on the back of that, we've also gone ahead to qualify them to fabricate flanges, for use in the industry. And the good news here is that the cost has gone down in terms of the cost that we pay for bolts and nuts. The time it takes to deliver has gone down. The quantity that we now need to store in our warehouses has reduced because we can now get it next door and real time. And this, again, is one of the important benefits that we talk about in terms of is local content really adding a premium. So we found that to be very positive. We've done the same thing with clamps, which is used for line breaks. That's now being manufactured locally by a company called Egba Clamp. We've done the same thing with anodes, currently being manufactured by Metec, a Nigerian company. And other aspects, cables, low voltage cables, medium voltage cables, etc. The list, goes on and on. Paints, being manufactured by local companies. And in certain cases, some of the paints that we've supported certification for are actually being shipped abroad to be used on major assets outside of the shores of Nigeria. One area I would like to talk about again is the area of training. Shell has played a pivotal role from the days where we invested in scholars, sending them to the best universities in the world, to supporting local training institutions to become world-class in nature, whether it be in terms of PVT analysis, whether it be in terms of welding technology, setting up laboratories, and supporting local entities in terms of vocational skill trainings. We've obviously done quite a lot in this area, and it's one that I am particularly proud of. One last thing I would just like to mention is around what we've done with the Bonny people. Bonny is really in the heart of the Niger Delta, where we've tried to support the setting up of a catering company, particularly to be run by the indigenes. We supported this, and this has been very successful. And other things like scaffolding that has been done by the indigenes, and they are providing services which are world-class in nature. As part of the Bonga Northwest project, we also did train some abseilers, scaffolders, and we got the very first female abseiler from Nigeria on the back of that project. So something that we are really, really proud of. In all, I would like to close by saying we believe that local content should not only be looked upon as a national imperative, but a business win-win if it's well applied and a balanced approach being followed. The government of Nigeria has been very receptive in terms of taking feedback on areas where it pinches, and have been very pragmatic in their approach towards helping the industry to find the right win in terms of the potential final outcomes. So we are proud of this effort, and I want to really say thank you for the opportunity to share at this forum, and I'm open to more questions during the discussions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Austin. Now that's a very, very thorough overview, and I think we'll switch now into the Q&A. And I think maybe I'll take the prerogative to have Jesse, maybe if you want to answer Kathy's question, and maybe I'll combine that with, if Kathy was asking about, would you recommend these hard targets and regulations, and then you mentioned the fact that it's hard to attribute, what success is from the attention versus what is the requirements. I guess maybe another way to ask that would be, maybe do you have any thoughts on what isn't working for sure? So, whatever the successes can be attributed to, maybe is a bit gray, but what things are definitely not working in your mind?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Jeff, and thank you, Austin, for the very thorough overview of Shell's activities in Nigeria. What I've done in the past, I've written about this dichotomy, this idea that there are hard local content policies that involve targets and regulations, and then there are soft policies that focus on training, on competitiveness, and on voluntary targets. I've argued that a mix of both is necessary. I've seen the earlier adopters of local content and the bigger oil producers like Nigeria and Angola adopt more of a hard approach, and more of the late adopters and people who've discovered oil more recently taking more of a voluntary approach. And I generally have argued that there need to be some hard targets in certain areas, but there's a lot of factors that influence that. So if you're a new oil producer, I think you need to evaluate how much local content you can demand through concrete, measurable, and specific targets. And I think you need to be mindful of the fact that local content does present a cost to the companies that are doing business, and does impact the revenues that you will get back, right? And I think that if we had better data on how local content works in various case studies, we could probably determine more accurately what countries should be doing. But I think, Jeff, in terms of what generally does not work and what hasn't been successful, across the board, local content requirements like what Austin described in Nigeria with over 100 sections and over 280 specific targets, I don't think that's been very helpful for Nigeria and for the countries that have basically followed Nigeria's approach, either adopting mostly the exact same targets and areas, or who've also tried to put in place policies across the board. But this is very difficult for government. Government is a little bit reluctant, obviously, to pick winners and losers. But that's to me how you build new forms of comparative advantage. You have to pick winners and losers, and you have to support them sometimes in concrete ways. So I would encourage countries to think about a few key industries that they might want to really focus on for in-country value, and think about setting hard targets in those areas. So think about 2 or 3 areas that are your top priorities, or 5 to 10 areas where you think you might want to set some targets. But when you set them across the board, what's happened in Nigeria is they just simply aren't met in a lot of cases. And then if the law doesn't actually envision that, or doesn't envision granting waivers, or even if it does envision granting waivers, which the Nigerian law did for the first 3 years after it was passed, it leaves a lot of discretion to government officials, and that's not necessarily what you want to see taking place. So I would like to think there's a role for hard targets, for government leading the way and explaining what the priorities should be. But obviously that needs to be done in consultation with not just the private sector, but with all stakeholders. So I'll stop there so there's lots of time for questions.
Oh, fantastic, Jessica. That was a really, really insightful answer. Yes, let's go to questions. There's about 35 of us on the line, so it'd be a bit, maybe not everybody can jump in at once, but if people could ask a question and identify themselves and go from there.
Okay, Jeff, I think on Austin also just wanted to make a quick addition to Jesse's comment.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. I just wanted to add, in terms of the priorities, if you look at a country like Norway, Norway focused on the marine and the shipping in the first instance, and that drove the progress that they made. They did not try to do it all in the one go, but just a couple of things. When you speak with the average Nigerian contractor or service provider, what you hear is it was 50 years, since we started exploring for oil before the law was passed. What was done in the first 50 years? But there's a perception that the past 7 years has been far more productive than the last 50 before the law was passed. So, we could also end up in the court of public opinion where there's a perception that the hard stand, the targets, have actually driven the progress far more than the voluntary, approach. Just to add that to Jesse's comments.
Great. Thanks very much. So questions? Jesse, did you see the question that came in the chat there?
I did. Yeah, that's an excellent question. I was.
Can you repeat it for everybody?
Yeah. So it was asked whether the Nigerian Content Development and Monitoring Board, the regulator in Nigeria, or other government organizations publish data on local content performance. And this has been something that I've been advocating for a long time, but they're still building up to the point, I think, where they'd be able to publish robust data. I think that data does exist. I think both government regulators and private companies have that data. Obviously, as an academic, it's in my interest to say I'll release all that data, but I think it's also in businesses' interest. I've been trying to follow the launch of the fund that the board is put together with the 1% they've been collecting, as Austin mentioned. And just the other day, I went back onto their website to see what information was involved. And there's a page now that says Nigerian Content Fund accounts. So I was really excited. I clicked onto that page. But it's just the bank accounts that you can pay them that 1% to. It's not any information about what they're using that 1% for. I know they're using it both to support local companies and to do some of their own capacity building initiatives. But I think it's very important that they report on exactly what they're doing and where they're spending their money. And for the private sector, that'll give them confidence that there's a level playing field.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Austin, there's a question for you on the chat. Can you see that?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, okay,
we're reading it now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think this one is above my pay grade. The question of the petroleum industry bill, which is just being passed. The fact is, there are two different pieces of legislation. While the petroleum industry bill focuses on the structure of the industry, the Nigerian Oil and Gas Industry Content Development Act focuses on the opportunities that you can derive from the industry in terms of local content. Howbeit, there are sections of the petroleum industry bill that tinkers a little bit with how contracts are placed, the timing for placement of contracts, which has been very long before now, it's 48 months in some cases. But hopefully with the PIB, that's going to reduce dramatically and help local businesses plan more in terms of their investments and their projection in terms of strategy. But that's the nexus that I see over and above, just being two different pieces of legislation.
Great. We have another question here about the distinction between jobs created by local business as a target. Sorry, I'm just reading it right now. Jesse, do you want to take a stab at this one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's highlighting an important distinction that often there's a confusion about what local content is and what it does, right? And whether it creates jobs directly or whether it creates jobs indirectly. And I think some of the mechanisms of local content will do one and some will do the other, right? And traditionally through the past in Nigeria and in other countries, there's always been an attempt to Nigerianize the workforce, right? And it's been slow going, but it's made progress in recent years, obviously, and to the point that Shell and other companies in Nigeria now have a very impressive number of locals employed. But directly, the oil industry is never going to employ that many people. So local content policies also have to focus on building up businesses that service the industry, that may employ lots of people. And those businesses, particularly when they're not delivering a service that's specific to the oil industry, but when they're delivering a service that has non-oil applications, it'll help grow the economy more general. So that's what you ideally want to see local content doing.
Great. A couple more questions there. Eric asked about sustainable development and examples in soil decontamination. So perhaps, Austin, do you have any examples of local companies being heavily involved in sort of the environmental side, environmental monitoring, cleanup, and that kind of thing?
Yes, we actually do have quite a bunch. I don't have the company names, and I'm not sure if I have the clear to mention names of such businesses. But as a strategy, it is part of what we drive, both in bioremediation for areas where you've had some level of contamination. It's also continue to involve the locals in the cleanup exercise.
Great. And so Mine has a really good question about how Nigeria is defined and how local is defined. Maybe, Kathy, I'd love to hear your thoughts first quickly on how does Shell as a company-wide, how do you approach that question of defining local? Do you sort of have a general set of principles which you then go into more detail when you actually apply it in each country, or how does Shell sort of go about setting the definition for local for each of their assets?
Okay, I'll answer this briefly, but I also welcome ask Helen and ask Austin to comment, since Helen in particular has worked on the local. So Shell does have a program which is called the Super-Local Community Development Program, which really targets those, the mom and pop shops that operate right around the communities where we operate. There is also, I think if you approach it from different countries, and the definition of local also comes from the legislation in the host country that we're operating in, is that some of those definitions are very clear, that local might mean national. Okay, so that is another area which we have to balance, because the government local content targets may be focused on national companies, whereas our license to operate as a business is very much in the communities around it. So, Helen,
maybe I can just chip in the case of Nigeria. So there are two groups. The first is those who consider their businesses indigenous in nature, which means 100% owned by Nigerians. That's considered indigenous, particularly by the definition of some of the service providers. But the law itself defines a Nigerian company as one that has not less than 51% Nigerian shareholding as registered under the Companies and Allied Matters Act of 2010. So in terms of definition, we follow the dictates of the law, which is the 51%. We also say that if you're from any part of Nigeria, you can actually do business in any part of the operational areas. However, special consideration, like an onion ring, is given to the people who are closest to the resource. And that's what we define as the Niger Delta community.
Yeah, I mean, I think I might also add, just from speaking from sort of more of a policy and a government relations perspective, in many cases, I mean, Shell has to comply with the law. There's no doubt about that. But trying to bring it in from the context of countries which are a bit more forward-looking. The world is globalizing. Value chains are definitely globally integrated. And in some of the countries that we work in, the question is, how do we create a forward-looking policy? Can Shell, as a company, not just help us work on the super local and the communities around, but think really, how do we as a country develop? So coming into Shell, I've been very pleased to see the level of engagement and dialogue which is happening, especially in those countries which are adapting for the future. With, I think, the comment that Jesse had made is sectors which might link to oil and gas, but which also service other parts of the economy. That's a very important point, and one which we take into account. I don't know, Helen, if you had any comments on the question on local?
Hi, Kathy. Can you hear me? I tried unmuting.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Yeah. So what we do in terms of definition is we align behind the IPECA guidance note on local content for 2016. So if you look within our internal documents, we use that as the common global definition to really introduce our staff to the topic and align with other peers. We think that that's helpful to take that approach, which I can kind of put into the chat box in a moment what that definition is. And then, then when we get down to discussions in country, we need to recognize that different language is used in country. So within Oman, for example, it's much more of a conversation about in-country value than referring back to local content. So we try to adapt to the local language and really understand what is the government and other stakeholders looking to achieve. But we find it helpful to align behind the IPECA definition.
I can maybe say something that helps answer this local question, also some of the questions Eric has been asking about bioremediation. Maybe it's a little bit more controversial, so I'll say it. I won't expect Shell to respond to it, but bioremediation is one of the activities that actually very local level companies can do, and there are companies in the Niger Delta that do bioremediation. There's two main areas that local companies in the Niger Delta are able to do. One is bioremediation, and the other is obviously offering security services. And both are controversial for reasons that Eric has raised, for reasons of the conflict in the Niger Delta, and so it raises some of the problems of trying to work at the community level as well, particularly in a difficult area like the Niger Delta, and it raises questions of who owns the companies that various international companies are working with. Sometimes that's a question for them too that they have difficulty finding an answer to when they do due diligence checks. It raises a question that I've written about. I've called it the problem of indigenization versus the problem of domiciliation, because sometimes it's not better to go with the most local level company. Sometimes it's better. It's actually better for local content to have greater in-country value by encouraging a foreign firm to domicile more of their activities, their economic activities, in the countries they work in, right? So local content has to balance all of those things, balance a variety of different issues and contexts in whatever locale it's working in. And it's actually a very complex issue, and part of why I studied is because it's such a good entry point for a variety of other topics if you're interested in particular countries or dynamics of political economy.
Great. Another really good question from Vera, and it kind of relates to this sort of question of standards of the IPECA. That was a really insightful answer, or interesting answer, Helen, about sort of where you look to for how to define local as kind of a basis. Linked to that, I suppose, is in Nigeria, Vera is asking about how does Shell work with standards in Nigeria? So, for example, the Nigerian Organization of Standards to make sure that goods and services meet the standard that Shell requires. So maybe if you can speak to how your global quality assurance standards mesh with sort of Nigerian in-country standards organizations.
Thanks, Jeff. So as you can probably tell, it takes a lot of effort to drive the development of local content, particularly when you're talking about new development, meeting the quality standards, meeting the safety standards. The government has a role to play, and we will also expect that the government will live up to that expectation. On our path, what we've done is to be clear about our standards and to be clear about our expectations to potential manufacturers and these suppliers. In cases where we see an opportunity, like some of the cases I'd mentioned, what we've done is to work hand in hand with the local suppliers or the local manufacturers and our technical authorities on quality and safety to help them meet our requirements, particularly in terms of the ISO certifications that they require, in terms of auditing the processes that they use to ensure that they meet the standards and requirements of Shell. And we found this very, very interesting because most of the companies actually want to do this. They don't want to be spoon-fed. They just want to be supported. And I think for us, it's not about lowering the standards. It's not about, finding just the products that are available, but helping the manufacturers, helping the suppliers meet the safety standards and the quality standards of the industry. And we've done quite a bit in terms of working with companies to get their ISO certifications before we begin to use these companies and put them on our procurement list.
Okay.
Great. We have just a couple minutes left, so is there maybe a final question?
Yeah, if I may say something, I think there was an important aspect that both Jesse and Austin have touched on that has been kind of now discussed further, and it is the regional dimension. And saying that from, of course, the point of view of the work that we are doing at the World Bank, we frequently encounter this idea that is surfacing. From our standpoint, it would seem that the regional dimension is obviously economically attractive, although the absorptive capacity of the particular region will at the end determine how much international trade one can do, and the competitiveness, of course, of the local company that is trying to internationalize in the region. But it's a little bit of a micro reality of the global value chain. At some point, we are noting at least political difficulties in promoting a regional dimensional local content, in the sense that it's hard for a citizen of a country to perceive as local what is not happening in its backyard. And there are some difficulties in moving forward with bilateral trade. I just wanted to hear from Austin what your experience as a company is. I'm sure that from the standpoint of a company having, for example, regional warehouses for pipes or material that are used in all assets is a fundamental, it's an important contribution to efficiency. Have you explored this dimension? What are the main hurdles that you find?
Thanks. Who was that?
It's Silvana.
Ovadia, hi. So thanks. That's one of the things that I typically will advocate. Sometime back, I supported the government of Gabon, working with the Minister of Petroleum, to try to develop a local content policy. The reason being that there's a perception that Gabon is very close to Nigeria, and they can benefit from our experience and some of the pitfalls that we've also had in the exploitation of our resource. Some of the opportunities that we discovered in terms of potential for new categories that can be developed in Gabon were shared with Nigerian suppliers. And Nigerian suppliers had the benefit of working with Gabonese suppliers on a regional approach to develop some of the capabilities in Gabon. And we see that also going west in Ghana, in Cote d'Ivoire, etc. But some of the key challenges that we see has to do with competitiveness and the ease of doing business. It's a bit of a challenge when you can't move freely within the region to do your regional trade, whether it be in terms of taxes, whether it be in terms of custom duties, migration, of quality staff, ability to get expatriation, the paperwork that is required in terms of government approvals, and the time that it takes sometimes to just be able to move staff within the region has been, incredibly challenging. The second key impediment is around business continuity. Where these companies set up shop in other countries and do not find appropriate level of work, then what you find is they begin to fold up again, and then the capabilities that you're trying to build fizzles out. So just having the short-term approach is not been very effective. But if you have a regional collaboration which maximizes the opportunities that you find within the region, may become very useful. There are other pitfalls to that also. You could also then have a challenge with the WTOs, and some of the agreements that you've signed to open up borders, in locking down within the region. So those need to be addressed before you can be very effective, with the regional approach. But is there an opportunity to develop, regional players, regional suppliers? The clear answer is yes. Nigerians have gone as far as Angola, to supply services to the Angolan oil companies. And I think more and more this collaboration needs to be enhanced. But a proper framework needs to be put in place to encourage companies that invest in this area and spend their money, to invest in new ventures.
Okay, great. It's about 11 o'clock, so maybe, Jesse, can I just give you the final word? And maybe that's a really great question, Sylvana. Jesse, do you have any thoughts, given you've worked also on Ghana and Angola, about sort of a general trend towards regional content? Is there more? Are you seeing more cooperation, for example, or is it the same as before?
I mean, in West Africa, I haven't seen a lot of cooperation. I originally started my PhD project with an idea that the Gulf of Guinea was a region, right? And that's what I wrote my book about, that all the countries in this region are facing similar dynamics, similar opportunities for development through petroleum resources. And I looked at what regional cooperation mechanisms did exist. There's a Gulf of Guinea Commission, there's all sorts of bilateral arrangements, but there isn't a lot of working together, and there's not enough time for the reasons why. But in West Africa, it would certainly be to Nigeria's advantage above any other country to promote a regional approach, because it has so much more capacity in terms of offering goods and services to the oil and gas industry. Angola has tried to build itself up as a bit of a hub for the region. In some ways, it's been more successful in doing that because it's been more targeted in its approach. And in reality, Jeff, it's probably Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. East Africa is a region that I think has the most potential to explore an approach, a regional local content approach. It's got all the disadvantages I mentioned, but on the other hand, no country can build new comparative advantages in all the different areas that are involved in oil and gas, in LNG plants, and so on. So if they picked different areas to set targets in, not necessarily across the continent, but in a group of countries like in East Africa, I think they would have a lot of success with that. There's a lot of political problems, as Sylvana mentioned, but I think there's actually in East Africa growing recognition that they should be trying to do this amongst regulators. So I would look to that region to see an example of it before. Unfortunately, I think you would see it in the Gulf of Guinea.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, well, we're at 11:05 here Eastern time. So we'll finish up there. Thanks so much for everybody joining. Thanks very much, Jesse, for your insights, as well as Shell for your, Austin and Kathy for laying out your company's approach, which is extremely practical and helpful for everybody on the line. This is going to be recorded, so we'll eventually post this on the ELLED Community of Practice, so people can sit down on a Friday night and watch this again. But we'll have some ongoing discussion, I'm sure, on the webinar on the community as well. And feel free to follow up with questions to any of the speakers on that platform. So thanks so much, and we'll be in touch soon, via email on the newsletter on upcoming webinars. Okay.
Great.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks,
and thank
Jeff.
you, Savannah.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everybody.
May make a suggestion.
Sorry?
There were a lot of very rich topics that have been touched upon but not really fully discussed. Just maybe you and I could talk offline and see if we can propose the 2-3 strands of offline discussion so that the participants may continue to explore those topics if everyone agrees.
Yeah, fantastic. We can do that. We'll maybe follow up some specific questions, and we can put them on the thread of the community practice. Great idea.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.